Okay, so LLMs, large language models,
Yeah.
they're like everywhere now, right?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Like I ask Siri for directions and boom, there's an LLM.
Right.
Or like using Google Translate LLMs again.
Behind the scenes, working their magic.
Exactly. So today, we're diving deep, no pun intended, into LLMs. And, I think a lot of people hear that term LLM, and it sounds super intimidating.
Yeah, it can seem like this whole other language.
Totally. But we're going to break it down.
We're going to demystify it.
Exactly. By the end of this, you'll be able to, hold your own in a conversation about LLM.
And impress your friend. Oh, you don't know what an LLM is? Let me enlighten you.
Exactly. So first things first, what is an LLM? Like in a nutshell.
Okay, so imagine a computer program that's really, really good with language. And I mean like scarily good.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It can understand what you're saying. It can generate text that sounds like a human wrote it.
Okay, so we're talking way beyond just basic grammar and spelling here.
Oh, way beyond. We're talking about understanding context, nuance, even humor.
Okay, now that's impressive.
It's all thanks to these things called neural networks. They're kind of like the building blocks of LLMs.
Neural networks. That sounds familiar. They're like inspired by the human brain, right?
Exactly. They're designed to mimic the way our brains process information.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture.
Hmm.
But how do these LLMs actually learn, They don't just magically appear knowing everything, do they?
They wish. No, it's all about data. And I mean massive amounts of data.
Okay, so feeding them information.
Yeah.
But what kind of data are we talking about?
Basically anything and everything. Books, articles, websites, code, you name it. The more data you feed them, the smarter they get.
So it's like giving them a crash course in, everything.
Pretty much. And here's the really cool part. Once they've been trained on all this data, they can start to see patterns and make connections that we might never even notice.
Okay, so they're not just memorizing information. They're actually learning from it and applying that knowledge in new and interesting ways.
Exactly. And that's where things get really exciting, because now we can start using these LLMs for all sorts of things.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, there's GPT, or Generative Pre-trained Transformer.
Catchy name.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the rock star of the LLM world right now.
Okay, so what makes GPT so special?
It's incredibly good at generating human-like text, like scarily good. You could ask it to write a poem in the style of Shakespeare, and it could probably do it.
Whoa. Okay, that's impressive. So it's like a digital Shakespeare channeling its inner bard.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing not all LLMs are poets, right?
You're right. There's BERT, for example.
Bird.
Bidirectional encoder representations from transformers.
Okay, I'm going to need you to unpack that one for me.
Basically, it's really good at understanding language, like really good.
So if I type in a grammatically challenged question into Google, Bert's the one who figures out what I mean.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the nuances of language, the context, the intent behind the words.
So Bert's the detective of the LLM world.
I like that. Yeah, you could say that.
This is already blowing my mind, and we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? And it gets even crazier.
Well, don't leave me hanging. What else is there to know about these LLMs?
Well, let's talk about how they actually work. Specifically, those transformers you mentioned earlier.
Okay, yes. Transformers. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. What's the deal with them?
It's funny you say that because they're kind of like the superheroes of the LLM world.
Okay, I am so here for this analogy. Go on.
So imagine you're reading a book.
Yeah.
You're not just processing each word individually, are you?
No, of course not.
You're thinking about the words in relation to each other. You're understanding the context, the subtext, the whole shebang.
Right, that's what makes reading enjoyable. You put all the pieces together.
Exactly, and that's what transformers do for LLMs. They allow them to process information in a way that takes into account the relationships between words rather than just treating each word as a separate entity.
So they're like super readers, speed readers on steroids.
Kind of, but more importantly, they're able to understand the nuances of language in a way that was impossible for earlier language models.
Okay, I'm starting to see why they're such a big deal.
And a big part of what makes transformers so powerful is this thing called self-attention.
Self-attention. Okay, break that down for me. I'm not sure I'm following.
So think about it like this. When you're reading a sentence, some words are more important than others.
Sure. Like the P words that give you the main idea.
Exactly. And self-attention allows the LLM to figure out which words are the most important and how they relate to each other.
So it's like the LLM is highlighting the key points as it's reading, just like we do when we're studying.
Precisely.
That's fascinating. But even with all this amazing technology, there have to be limits, right?
Of course, LLMs aren't perfect.
So what are some of their limitations? What are the things they still struggle with?
Well, one big one is context.
Context,
Yeah,
like the surrounding information.
exactly. LLMs have a limited context window, which means they can only process a certain amount of information at once.
Oh, so it's like their short-term memory. They can only remember so much at a time.
Exactly. And if you try to give them too much information at once, they might get confused or forget important details.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have to be mindful of what we feed them, just like we do with our own brains. Too much information overload, and things start to get fuzzy.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
So we've talked about what LLMs are, how they work, and some of their limitations. But how do we actually use them? Like, how do we talk to these things?
It's all about prompting.
Prompting, like giving them instructions.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You're the director, and the LLM is your actor. You need to give them clear and specific instructions if you want them to perform the way you want them to.
Oh, that's a great analogy. So it's not just about typing in a question. It's about crafting the perfect prompt to get the desired response.
Exactly. It's a skill, an art form even. And the better you get at prompting, the better the LLM will be able to understand what you want and deliver amazing results.
Okay, so prompting is key.
Absolutely.
But it's not always easy, right?
Yep.
Like sometimes you might not even know what you want the LLM to do.
Sure.
Or you might have a vague idea, but you're not sure how to put it into words.
Oh, I feel you. It can definitely be tricky. And that's where prompt engineering comes in.
Prompt engineering. Sounds intense.
It can be. But it's basically the art and science of crafting the perfect prompt.
So are there like schools for this
Yeah.
where I can get my PhD in prompt engineering?
Not yet, but maybe someday.
I'll be first in line to enroll.
But in all seriousness, there are a lot of resources available online, and people are constantly coming up with new and innovative prompting techniques. It's a rapidly evolving field.
So it's like the Wild West of AI.
Kind of. It's exciting, it's unpredictable, and the possibilities are endless.
This is incredible. I had no idea. There was so much to learn about LLMs, and we've only just scratched the surface.
That's the thing about this field. There's always something new to discover. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Well, I'm hooked. I can't wait to dive deeper into the world of LLMs and see what other amazing things they can do.
Me too. And luckily, we've got plenty more to talk about.
Perfect. Because I'm ready for more.
So last time we were talking about prompting and how it's like giving instructions to an LLM.
Yeah, like we're the directors and the LLM is our very obedient, very literal actor. But we also touched on how prompting can be tricky.
It definitely can be.
Like, what if you're not even sure what you want the LLM to do? Or you have a vague idea but no clue how to put it into words.
Happens all the time. And that's where prompt engineering comes in.
Okay, so prompt engineering, it's like taking prompting to the next level, right?
Exactly. It's about crafting the perfect prompt, like really thinking about the language you're using, the context you're providing, even the tone you want to evoke.
So it's more than just asking a question. It's about setting the stage for the LLM to give you the best possible response.
Exactly. It's like the difference between saying, write me a story, and saying, write me a spooky story about a haunted house on a stormy night with a twist ending.
Okay, I get it. The more specific you are, the better the result.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, there are all these techniques and strategies you can use to make your prompts even more effective.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one technique is called few-shot learning. Basically, you give the LLM a few examples of what you want before you ask it to do something new.
Oh, so it's like showing a kid a few pictures of cats and dogs before you ask them to identify a new one.
Exactly. Those examples give the LLM a little bit of context and help it understand what you're looking for.
That makes sense. And I bet it's especially useful for tasks that are a little more complex or nuanced.
You got it. And then there's zero-shot learning.
Zero shot. So like no training wheels at all.
Pretty much. It's like asking someone to translate a phrase into Spanish even though they've never formally studied the language.
And sometimes they can, right? Just from picking up bits and pieces here and there.
Exactly. And that's kind of what zero-shot learning is all about. It's relying on the LLM's vast knowledge base to figure things out, even if it's never seen that exact task before.
Wow, that's impressive. But I imagine it's not always accurate, right? Especially for more complicated tasks.
You're right. That's why few-shot learning is often a safer bet for those kinds of tasks. But zero-shot learning is still a super promising area of research.
I bet. It's like the holy grail of AI, right?
Yeah.
Getting these LLMs to learn and adapt without any explicit training.
Exactly. And speaking of training, or should I say fine-tuning,
Fine-tuning, is that like giving the LLM a little extra polish?
Sorta. It's like taking a general purpose LLM and specializing it for a particular task. Like, imagine you have a chef who's really good at making all sorts of different dishes,
Okay, I'm with you.
but then you want them to specialize in, say, Italian cuisine. So you give them some extra training, maybe send them to Italy for a while to really immerse themselves in the culture and the techniques.
So they become a master of Italian food instead of
Okay.
just being good at everything.
Exactly. And that's kind of what fine-tuning is all about. You're taking an LLM that's already really knowledgeable, and you're giving it some specialized training to make it even better at a particular task.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
So if you wanted to create a chatbot that could answer questions about astrophysics, you would fine-tune an LLM on a bunch of astronomy textbooks and research papers.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, fine-tuned LLMs often outperform their more general counterparts, even if those general LLMs have access to way more data.
Really, so it's not just about the quantity of data, it's about the quality and relevance of that data.
Exactly. And that's why fine-tuning is such a powerful technique.
This is fascinating. I'm starting to see how all these different pieces fit together. But as amazing as LLMs are, I'm sure they're not perfect, right? There have to be some challenges or limitations that researchers are still working on.
Oh, absolutely. LLMs are still under development, and there's always room for improvement.
So what are some of the areas where LLMs still struggle? What are the things that keep AI researchers up at night?
Well, one big one is bias.
Bias, like showing favoritism towards certain viewpoints or groups.
Exactly. Remember how we talked about LLMs being trained on massive amounts of data?
Yeah, it's like their crash course in everything.
Right. But if that data is biased, then the LLM might learn those biases too.
Well, that makes sense. It's like garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. And this is a huge concern because if an LLM is biased, it could lead to all sorts of problems like discrimination or unfair treatment.
That's a scary thought. So how do we prevent that from happening? How do we make sure these LLMs are fair and unbiased?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that researchers are actively working on. One approach is to try to make the training data more balanced and representative.
So like making sure that the LLM is exposed to a diverse range of viewpoints and perspectives.
Exactly. And another approach is to develop techniques for detecting and mitigating bias in LLMs. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that we need to address if we want to ensure that these powerful technologies are used responsibly and ethically.
I couldn't agree more. It's like with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Exactly.
And speaking of responsibility, I imagine there are also concerns about how LLMs might be used maliciously.
Absolutely. That's another big challenge because LLMs are so good at generating human-like text, they could potentially be used to create fake news, spread misinformation, or even impersonate real people.
Whoa. Okay, yeah, that's definitely something to be concerned about. It's like the dark side of AI.
Right. And that's why it's so important to have ethical guidelines and regulations in place to prevent these technologies from being used for harmful purposes.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that we're staying one step ahead of the bad guys. But on a more positive note, I'm curious, what are some of the most exciting potential applications of LLMs?
Oh man, where do I even begin?
I don't know. You're the expert.
Okay, well, one area where I think LLMs have huge potential is in education. Imagine having a personalized AI tutor that could tailor its teaching style to each individual student's needs.
That would be incredible. No more one-size-fits-all education.
Exactly. And it could also help to address some of the inequalities that exist in our current education system by providing students from all backgrounds with access to high-quality learning experiences.
I love that. Making education more accessible and equitable for everyone.
And that's just one example. LLMs could also revolutionize healthcare by helping doctors to diagnose diseases more accurately, develop new treatments, and even communicate with patients who speak different languages.
Wow, the possibilities are endless. It's like we're on the cusp of a new era where AI is going to transform every aspect of our lives.
It really does feel that way. And the most exciting part is we're only just getting started. Who knows what incredible things we'll be able to achieve with LLMs in the years to come.
I can't wait to find out.
Yeah, and with all this talk about the amazing potential of LLMs, it's easy to get caught up in the hype.
Right, like, are we all going to have robot butlers and flying cars powered by AI?
Well, maybe someday. But for now, I think it's important to stay grounded and remember that LLMs are still tools.
Tools.
Yeah, they're tools that can be used for good or for bad. It all depends on who's using them and what their intentions are.
Okay, that makes sense. So, like any powerful tool, we need to be careful about how we use them.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations about the ethical implications of LLMs.
Right, because it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how that technology impacts society as a whole.
Exactly. We need to be thinking about things like bias, fairness, accountability, transparency.
Ooh, okay, slow down. Let's unpack those one at a time.
You got it. So let's start with bias.
Okay, bias. We touched on this a bit last time. It's like when an LLM shows favoritism towards certain viewpoints or groups.
Exactly. And it's a huge problem because if an LLM is biased, it can perpetuate and even amplify those biases in the real world.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely not good. So how do we address that?
Well, it starts with the data. LLMs are trained on massive amounts of data, and if that data is biased, then the LLM is likely to be biased too.
Right, it's like garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. So we need to make sure that the data we're using to train these LLMs is as diverse and representative as possible.
So like making sure that the LLM is exposed to a wide range of viewpoints and perspectives, not just the ones that are dominant or popular.
Exactly. And it's not just about the data itself, it's also about who's creating and curating that data.
Oh, right. Because if the people who are building these LLMs are coming from a narrow range of backgrounds and perspectives, then that's going to be reflected in the technology itself.
Precisely. So we need to make sure that the teams who are developing these LLMs are diverse and inclusive.
Okay, so diversity in data and diversity in the people who are building these systems, that makes sense. But even if we address the bias issue, there's still other ethical concerns, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like fairness, for example.
Fairness. Okay, break that down for me.
Well, let's say you're using an LLM to make decisions about things like loan applications or job interviews.
Okay, so high-stakes situations.
Exactly. We need to make sure that those decisions are being made fairly and objectively, and that the LLM isn't discriminating against certain groups of people.
So it's not just about making sure that the LLM itself is unbiased, it's also about making sure that it's being used in a way that's fair and equitable.
Exactly, and that's a really complex challenge because it involves thinking about things like algorithmic accountability and transparency.
Okay, more big words. Algorithmic accountability, what does that mean?
It basically means that we need to be able to understand how these LLMs are making decisions and hold them accountable if those decisions are harmful or unfair.
So like if an LLM makes a decision that negatively impacts someone, we need to be able to trace that decision back to the algorithm itself and figure out why it happened.
Exactly. And that's not always easy to do because these LLMs can be incredibly complex.
Right, it's like they're kind of a black box. We put data in, we get results out, but we don't always know what's happening in between.
Exactly. And that's why transparency is so important. We need to be able to look under the hood of these LLMs and understand how they work.
So that we can identify potential problems and fix them before they cause real-world harm.
Exactly. It's about building trust and accountability into these systems from the ground up.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense.
Yeah.
But it also feels like a lot to think about. Like, how do we even begin to address all of these complex ethical challenges?
It's definitely a tall order, but the good news is that there are a lot of people who are working on these issues.
Okay, that's reassuring. So what are some of the things that are being done to address these ethical concerns?
Well, for starters, there's a growing movement within the AI community to develop ethical guidelines and best practices for developing and deploying LLMs.
Oh, so like a code of conduct for AI researchers and developers.
Exactly. And some governments are even starting to introduce regulations around the use of AI.
Okay, so things are starting to move in the right direction, but it sounds like there's still a long way to go.
Oh, for sure. This is an ongoing conversation, and it's one that we all need to be a part of.
Well said. Because it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how that technology shapes our world and our future.
Exactly. And that's a responsibility that we all share.
Wow, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about LLMs, from the technical details to the broader societal implications.
Me too. It's been a pleasure exploring these topics with you.
And to our listeners, we hope this has given you a lot to think about. LLMs are powerful tools, and it's up to all of us to make sure that they're used for good. So stay informed, stay engaged, and let's work together to shape the future of AI in a way that benefits everyone.
Absolutely.
That's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world around us.